Thanks for joining us for this archive of Teaching American History's Saturday webinar for Saturday, April 10th, 2021. Today's program is about late 20th century social reformer and political activist Fannie Lou Hamer, and is the fourth in our Remember the Ladies series of webinars for spring 2021. As usual, our moderator was Dr. Chris Burkett, professor of political science at Ashland University, and he was joined by Drs. Sarah Beth Kitch and Dr. Jay Green. Thanks for listening.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another teachingamericanhistory.org Saturday webinar, sponsored by the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. TAH.org is the leading online resource for the documents-based study of American history, government, and civics for teachers, students, and citizens. I'm Chris Burkett. I teach political science here at Ashland University. Happy to be with you this morning. So the theme of our webinar series this spring semester is Remember the Ladies. And if you happen to be joining us for the first time, the point of these webinars is to bring together some thoughtful scholars and just have a lively conversation about important historical figures. And I encourage all of you joining us today to participate in our conversation by submitting questions via the chat function. Sorry, I apologize, via the Q&A function, not the chat function. And please be sure to send those so everybody can see that in the chat box. And we'll try to get to as many of those as possible. In the Q&A box, I'm sorry. And we'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible. In the next week, you'll receive an email with a link with which you can request a certificate of participation. And that email will also include a link to the archived video and audio from today's program. So today we're talking about Fannie Lou Hamer, and I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Sarah Beth Kitch of the University of Missouri and Dr. Jay Green of Covenant College to help us think about Fannie Lou Hamer. So good morning to both of you, and thank you for joining us.
Hey, good morning. Thanks y'all for being here.
So Fannie Lou Hamer is a really important historical figure, but one about whom I knew very little until recently. When I was younger, many years ago, I remember studying the civil rights movement in high school, but her name never came up. We talked a lot about Dr. King and Malcolm X, but she seems to have been, at least for a while, a kind of forgotten figure in terms of being an important historical figure. And she's sort of enjoying a resurgence of interest recently. So maybe to start with, would you guys mind starting to tell us a little bit about why you think that there's been this renewed interest in Fannie Lou Hamer? Either of you can jump in, please.
Jay, would you like to begin?
That's a good question. I think some of it has to do, I think, over the last 6 years since the shooting in Ferguson, and then of course the events of the summer of 2020 and all kinds of factors in between. I think there's been this kind of astonishing resurgence of or awakening of interest in the history of civil rights, the African American experience more broadly. And I do think that when we look at the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, we see someone who has lived and embodied so many of the profound both injustices, but also as an activist has led the way in sort of shining a light on and becoming an advocate for broader themes of justice, political rights, that I think that her place, she's always had a good place in the larger historiography of the civil rights movement, but I think this broadened consciousness of the African American experience has shone a light on her, and as well as others.
And that's so true. I am sure that I had heard her name at some point, but when I lived in Princeton on a postdoc, I heard Professor Al Rabbitoe, professor of African American religion at Princeton, deliver his chapter on Hamer. And he's from the Delta, and she's from the Delta, and I'm from the Delta. And I thought, this is a piece of the story that I need to make sense of the world that I live in. As an academic, I've moved a lot in the last few years. And so my primary care doctor is still in Baton Rouge, where I'm from and where I went to grad school. And I was in the office with the nurse one day, an African-American woman, and she said, you know, the doctor you see, he's so great. He treats you the same, whether you're Black or white. And I thought, like, Fannie Lou Hamer tells this story because her story is not far removed. Like, my mom was a kid just a few hundred miles from where she's doing all of this, from where she's being beaten. And I think that when Ferguson brought to national consciousness, as Jay's saying, these tensions and these pains that were below the surface, at least I found students started to say, like, will you talk to us about this story? And they wanted to know. And so we started with King, but in Baton Rouge, they wanted to know, like, well, who else was organizing? Like, who are the people who were doing things? And so when Alton Sterling was killed, and some of my students were then figuring out, like, how do we respond? What do we do? They were looking for figures like Hamer, who had modeled what it was to be thoughtful and to be hopeful and to take action in the midst of grave injustice that was just so familiar. We didn't really articulate it well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And again, this is what I've found so fascinating about her as I've learned more of her over the last few years. But it's, again, you know, we know the names of Dr. King and Malcolm X and a lot of others. And I don't mean to, you know, to diminish their importance, but when you start to realize that there are people like her involved in this, you start to see that their stories are really unique. She has a very unique experience. Some of the things she you know, endures and struggles through, and then you know, and fights against in her own way is a very unique thing to her because of her own experiences. And I've come to find that sort of approach to these important persons to be really interesting. So growing up in Mississippi, right? She was apparently raised on a farm. She was was she the last of 20 children? And you know, and her parents worked on a farm that they didn't, or you know, a plantation essentially that they didn't own. She didn't get much formal education, did she? She got some education, I believe, but
She did not. She went to school through the third grade, and then very intermittently until I think she was about maybe 12 or 13. And the amazing thing is how much she gleaned from that time. Lyndon Johnson once dismissed her as that illiterate woman. She was not illiterate. And actually she was, well, and we'll get into this a little bit, but she was extraordinarily curious and deeply familiar with the scriptures, with the Old and New Testament scriptures. So she, even though she only had very limited education, she made the most of it throughout her life. But she was in the cotton fields 13, 14 hours a day, 6, sometimes 7 days a week, throughout most of her life. And that had been the life of her parents and her grandparents before her. So that really marked her and really defined her life.
Yeah, I think it's hard to imagine sometimes, or at least I find Mississippi Public Broadcasting has done a lovely documentary on her life. And when I show it to students and they think about it, they say, that looks kind of a lot like slavery, but it's the 1960s in America. How can this be? And yet the model of sharecropping is, it's a plantation model where you well, one of the things that Hamer observes to her mother when she's real young, she says, I want to be white. And her mother says, why would you want to be white? And she says, well, we work all the time and we don't have anything. Like sometimes what we have is bread and water. And the people that we work for, they don't do this and they have plenty. So Hamer, as a young child, deduces like what you need to make it is to be white in Mississippi. And her mom like takes in this precocious person's observation and begins to show her the ways in which this model is actually harming the family who is employing the Hamers, or is employing the Townsends, and encourages her and said to be aware of the moral injury that these people are subjecting themselves to by perpetuating this model of degradation and of sucking the life out of a family through this form of coercive labor.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, really have to make no mistake that the life of sharecropping was very little removed from slavery in all kinds of ways, both formal or informal and actually legal. Families like the Townsends, and as you said, she was the youngest of 20, which actually made their family very desirable because that's a lot of labor. The system was set up so that families like theirs were supposed to literally share the profits of crops derived from the land, but it was also based on a system of credit, and it was money was taken out for their housing, which was deplorable. And they only received any kind of, they also could only shop at stores that were owned by these same sharecroppers. And it became a system where they were perpetually and generationally in debt, and therefore made it virtually impossible for them to ever break out on their own or to get out from under the power of this system. So it was clearly, and this is one of the most, I think one of the powerful things about her life is because that was her life entirely, and she was well into her 40s by the time she ever kind of became the Fannie Lou Hamer of that we know about. She had a very close and visceral link to this world of slavery, neo-slavery. And so I think her being able to give voice to that in very personal, detailed ways, I think is one of the things that makes her voice so powerful.
Yeah, that's very well put. And again, it just, you're reminding me that the fact that, yes, slavery as an institution has long been abolished, but the actual conditions, you put it as, are essentially neo-slavery 100 years later. Is absolutely remarkable and troubling. But I wish I had read Timothy. Timothy asked the question better than I did. Do you think that her common person, as a common person that has a kind of appeal, could play a role in her not being as well known? I mean, as you have pointed out, Jay, she was a sharecropper as opposed to an intellectual, right? So sometimes we tend to focus on the intellectual leaders, so-called, of the civil rights movement. But perhaps her common background makes her an interesting person to study. So she comes from a unique perspective, and there seems to be a kind of renewed interest in those perspectives as well, in addition to, again, the people we think of as sort of the intellectual leaders of the civil rights movement.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the same thing that made her a powerful figure when she rose to prominence was her capacity to deliver in very, very real and authentic ways a personal narrative. I think that's the very thing that makes her compelling again. But she played a role, and she spoke on the national stage multiple times, but she never really left Mississippi, and she lived out her days in poverty, and died quite young through kind of the multiple and compounding effects of because it destroyed her health of the hard life that she lived. So in that regard, she never, she played a role in multiple organizations, but she didn't lead any of them, and never sort of rose out of the circumstances that had marked her life. So I think that's one of the things that makes her quite different from other civil rights figures, but also, again, makes her so compelling.
Yeah, and Sonia had asked about the fact that she died so young, and was wondering if it was related to the beatings that she had received on numerous occasions, probably both as a, working as a sharecropper, but also when she would, show up and protest the, voting test and not being allowed to vote and run for office. She had been beaten multiple times viciously, right? So,
well, Ta-Nehisi Coates has urged us to think about the Black experience in terms of the Black body. I found that to be a really deeply moving and also very just difficult thing to process. Fannie Lou Hamer, you can tell the story of her life by her body, and as a young child, she was attended to by older siblings, and her leg was broken, and it was never set or properly fixed, and she walked with a limp for the rest of her life. Because she didn't have access, or African Americans didn't have access to much of any kind of healthcare or provisions, she contracted polio and lived with the effects of polio the rest of her life. Certainly the physical effects of the daily grind of working in the fields. And then, of course, probably one of the defining facts of her life is when she was beaten nearly to death in being held in a jail in Winona, Mississippi in the summer of 1963, left her with a permanent damage to her kidney and a blood clot in her eye, in her right eye. And the list goes on. I mean, and then she ends up contracting. She had various other diseases and ended up dying of cancer. So her body really tells the story all by itself of a life that's marginalized and lacking access to health, and so that is significant.
There's one. I'm moved, Jay, even by the way you present that, and that gives even more context. I had not known the piece about her leg being broken, but it's not surprising. There's another piece about her embodiment that is deeply tied to American history, and that is that as a younger woman, she had married Hap Hamer, and she had a tumor, and so she went to the hospital to have the tumor removed, and afterward they found that they couldn't have children, and they discovered that she, like many Black women and women of color, had been given a forced hysterectomy against her knowledge, against her will. And these kinds of hysterectomies, this kind of forced sterilization, continued in the US into the early 70s. And she and her husband adopted 2 children after that, 2 of her nieces, and then one of her daughters dies because no one will give her treatment when she's hemorrhaging, and there's no treatment there. So they get in the car and they're driving, I think, to Gats, and they're driving over 120 miles, and her daughter dies there, and then she adopts that daughter's children, and partly because that daughter's those children's father has been in the service. Like, this story of embodiment and bearing in the body. And I think that part of what she knows, part of what Fannie Lou Hamer deeply knows that she has to tell us, as Jay's highlighting, this gift of storytelling that is so resonant for us as human creatures. Part of what she knows is what it is to bear injustice in her body. And she knows that in particular ways also as a woman, as a mother, and as someone who nurtures. Like, she she is both doing the work of, eventually we'll get to it, of organizing people for civil mobilization. But one of her points is that you can't very well have a civic presence if you're starved and dead. And so she's also eventually organizing a freedom farm. And June Jordan writes a beautiful poem about that we can bring up later. But this intimate connection of woman to life and of her intense battle with so many things that are designed to kill, designed to take away life, designed to sterilize. And that is how she comes to know the generosity, the generative, the creativity that she brings forth.
That's good.
Yeah, it's very thoughtful. So there are a number of great questions coming in. And I'm going to turn to some of these here in just a second, but you've mentioned a couple of things that, or some great things that have made me remember a couple of things. And at some point, I'd like to ask about her presence on the national level. I think one of you mentioned that LBJ sort of was very dismissive of her. And I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about that at some point if we can. But the other thing you're reminding me more immediately is that I get the sense sometimes that in the minds of a lot of people who have some familiarity with the civil rights movement, there's this perception that, after Brown v. Board of Education and then after the Civil Rights Act, everything is, everything's on the right track. But she's an activist well into the 70s, right? And it reminds me that the Civil Rights Act doesn't necessarily immediately end the problem. And so she's continuing. I think in many ways, what makes her interesting to me is that she is continuing to fight for justice, again, in her own way, and especially in Mississippi, because that's the only way this is going to get done. It's great that you pass the Civil Rights Act, but it's not like there are national or federal agents out there looking for, racism or violations of civil rights. This has to be done on the ground level in a way, right? So, this was all prompted by a question that Adam asked about what qualities of her personality or experiences may have led her to be this kind of grassroots activist. And again, stay sort of local within Mississippi. So we'll start with that question.
It's a great question and go a lot of different directions with that. I think the single most remarkable thing about Fannie Lou Hamer, and I think the most important thing to know about her that makes her life so even more compelling, is that she was 44 years old, and it was the summer of 1962 before she learned for the first time that she had a constitutional right to vote. Now think about that. She's 44, so she's lived every moment of her life up to that point on a plantation. It's 1962. We're 8 years, my math, roughly 8 years from Brown. A lot of other events have occurred. Martin Luther King is certainly a nationally prominent figure. She's learning for the first time that she has a constitutional right to vote and begins to undergo the process of moving toward having that right to vote, obviously, and then becoming registered and actually voting are very different things. About 7%, I think, either the population of Mississippi or of Sunflower County, where she was from, of African Americans were even registered at the time. So that alone, so she lives she's only known that she has the right to vote for the last 15 years of her life. And what she manages to do within that span of time is nothing short of astonishing. So I think that she, I'll say this, I'm not sure about her personality is remarkable on its own terms. I think she would say this, and it's found kind of repeatedly in her speeches. She has a deep, vital, vibrant Christian faith. And I think she would say that the Black church, even when it was failing to become active and to assert itself within the civil rights movement, she would say that it had sustained her and prepared her to move forward in the kind of activism that she took up. So there's always a very close link between her faith and between her activism. And it was even her singing spirituals on a bus on the way from Ruleville to Indianola to try to get registered to vote that really had inspired some of the SNCC activists to say, this lady there's something about her. There's something about her spirit, her courage, her sense of purpose that was, and she didn't get this from a lot of preparation in the movement. She got this from her life and from her deep investment in the Black church. So I would say that you can't understand anything about what she does in those last 15 years without understanding at least that.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. She highlights, I want to explore further two things that Jay is talking about. She highlights the role that her mom plays in instilling a sense of self-respect in her. There's the story which she will tell in her speeches, in which you may come across that her mom, every day when they would go out to the field, her mom would carry a bucket covered with a towel. And one day she finally looks under the towel and there is Luger. Like, her mom is not messing around, and her mom is not going to have her kids subject to threat. And so how does she meet that threat? She brings her own. So Hamer is not necessarily raised in the tradition of nonviolence, but she finds a security that her mom provides for her, and both of her parents praise her and encourage her and are delighted in her success as she's learning and studying, even in her few years in school. They spend time teaching her how to resist dehumanization, partly through the story that I've just mentioned, but also through song, as Jay's mentioned. And that experience of song happens with her mom in the fields. Like, her mom looked for ways to make this experience of, what comes to mind is the story of the Hebrews. And the whole point of God giving the Sabbath is that you are not a slave to the labor, that there is, one of the points is that there is reprieve from labor, that you are not enslaved to this. And the entire structure of neo-slavery is the antithesis of that kind of Sabbath orientation and rest. And so how do you teach children to be human in the midst of that? Her mom looked for ways to make their work into games. She helped them to sing. She looked for ways to sustain their spirits, and that's deeply formative. The church tradition that Jay's already mentioned, also deeply formative. And I think an important theme within that tradition is the prophetic tradition. So Hamer is a part of this tradition that is premised on the idea that God cares about justice. The prophetic tradition goes back to the prophets of Israel, in whom she is deeply literate through the oral tradition and the pulpit of the Black church. And it's this conviction that God cares about justice and that God cares about us. And that has a few elements. It carries the voice of judgment. It gives her ground to stand on to say, this is wrong. So her mom's reinforcement of a pride in being Black and a pride in being just, even when you are wronged, that you're not the person who is running this neo-slavery system. Like, you're just even when you're wronged. That's a better position to be in. Her mom's pride in that, combined with this prophetic tradition that says you have a place to stand and to judge. Woe to those who put evil for good and good for evil, who put bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter, says Isaiah. And that tradition is deeply formative for her. The voice of judgment gives way to room to articulate pain and suffering. And that's what she does so well in storytelling. And from there, she can give a summons for action. And that dynamic prophetic tradition enables her to do what she does, even when like women are not doing this on the whole. It is very unconventional for her to be doing this. But those two pieces, her home life and the prophetic tradition, form her for this moment.
That is really fascinating. I had never thought of it that way. I don't know much about the prophetic tradition, so I'm glad you explained a little bit about what that is. And I think you anticipated Catherine's question, which was, what do you feel was the significance of Hamer's reference to religious scripture and hymns? I think that's what you just, what you just said was a good answer to that question. Unless there's anything else you'd like to add to that. There are a number of questions, by the way. I hope you can see the Q&A. Number of questions about her use of scripture,
Sure.
reliance on scripture. Tom says so much of the way she makes her arguments is based on scripture. And this seems to be a kind of through line in the civil rights movement, whether it's with Dr. King or Reverend Warnock, particularly in the South. And Tom asks whether the extent to which these sort of regional differences, surrounding moral authority were tied to religion, whether or not as such arguments would have been affected with people who were of a more secular mindset during the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I think Hamer is an important figure as a reminder of both the deep-seated religious impulses that existed within the civil rights movement, particularly among African Americans, but also that there was a culture clash that sometimes reflected the racial lines, but also in other times just affected where someone was from, what their formative reasons for participating in the civil rights movement was. But between those who saw it largely as a purely secular movement and one that saw it not just as nourished from religious faith, but also defined by religious faith. And Hamer was totally unapologetic. I found this quote from an early biographer of Hamer, and it said that Hamer had not been, this is Kate Mills, she said, Hamer had not been processed through any part of the system that usually renders someone controllable, at least in the eyes of those in power. And here we're talking about the machinery and infrastructure of the movement, not just talking about power more broadly, but the movement and the way in which people work within it. Even within the movement, she was not controllable. I mean, she was savvy and she knew how to pull back a little bit on the religious rhetoric if she was standing before an audience that wasn't going to sort of be moved by that. So she understood that. But just to finish this quote, it says she wasn't a product of the educational system or of a labor union or a political system. She owed nothing to no one, and she was uncompromising as a result. So I think that's one of the things that there's a radicalism. Sometimes we think about those who are tied to the Black church or Christian faith as there being kind of guardrails put on them, or it makes them less moved by radical politics. There was nothing about her that I think she was definitely a radical because of her rootedness in the prophetic tradition, not in spite of it.
That's a great point. By the way, Jay, that's sort of touches on a question from Christopher asks, one sees again clearly in her speeches and fearless and contextual quotations of scripture that her religious faith was crucial in her life and leadership. Is it possible that one reason she is invisible today is because that these beliefs are rarely a part of our conversation about race and civil rights? That raises some interesting questions. Do we see the influence of the prophetic tradition today as much?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So a couple of, I guess we could talk about the relevance of the prophetic tradition, then go back and kind of look at more pieces of it through her work. One of the difficulties I have found, like I have done some work on King and the prophetic tradition, and you go around, you talk about King and the prophetic tradition, and people are like, but do we care about that anymore? And I think there are some things to notice. One, historically, and in terms of what moved these people, we don't understand King and we don't understand Hamer without this confidence, because the confidence is not quite what you'd call a paradox, but it's this. One, justice prevails because God cares about justice, because God is active in history. Justice will prevail. And two, we don't move an inch toward justice without human cooperation. There's this deep insistence that God depends on human action for justice. And Hamer holds those two things together, which gives her great confidence and great urgency. And that is consistent with the prophetic tradition, that what is special about being human is that we can act. And Hamer is such a stringent critic of human action, right? She's constantly pointing out places where people are dishonest about what they're doing, where they are holding double standards, where they are, for example, protesting amalgamation and raping Black women, right? Like this is one of her things. She's really interested in our responsibility and our action. So she holds those two things together. Justice prevails and it depends on me. And she puts those together, and she has this multi-level rhetoric where she is speaking in the prose and poetry of the scriptures and of the prophetic scriptures. And she's also telling her story. And that, I think, accomplishes what people like Martin Luther King Jr. figure out, which is how do you make a moral argument, but how do you also make a pragmatic argument, or an argument that's going to resonate at some other level? The most famous example of King doing this is in the letter from Birmingham jail, where he says an unjust law, he's quoting Aquinas, that an unjust law is no law, but how do we know what a just law is? It uplifts human personality. How do we know what an unjust law is? It degrades human personality. And then skip a paragraph, the next one down, he gives this argument about majority rule and minority consent, and how from a democratic perspective, from a power sharing perspective, we could think about just and unjust laws. And that multi-level rhetoric is something that Hamer is really keyed into as well. In terms of its resonance today, I think what I find in the classroom and what I find in conversations, Hamer lives at a moment in American history which is special in terms of its religious character. It's not the norm. The 60s in America are not necessarily the norm for religion in America. But I think that whether people hold those same commitments or not, there's something really compelling. There's a reservoir, there's a resource for action and for confidence that is intriguing and invites us to pursue, to press. What is it that moved her and sustained her? And to get there, we have to take her prophetic tradition seriously.
Good. There is, when we read her personal story and all of the dynamics of it, it is easy to simply be moved to despair because of its bleakness, because of its seemingly hopeless, in the face of the enormity of the injustice, the enormity of the suffering, to just simply say, "Are you kidding?" and to give up. And she wrestles with that. And I think the thing that's remarkable about her life and her story is that in the midst of that bleakness, she has this through line of love and of forgiveness that is really something that I would say is out of step with the current discourse on race, that is kind of that feels like an escape hatch that we're not willing to sort of deal with, or an easy way out, or is it pie in the sky by and by? That's definitely not the truth. And as Sarah, I think, was really well saying, that she kind of holds these things together. But I do think that that's among the more remarkable things, is that she still is, there's a joy and a sense of calm in the midst of this deeply broken body and structure that she's a part of that is also one of the things that is you don't see very much today, partly maybe because the Christian tradition is very much viewed by a lot of activists as being counterproductive rather than useful. But I also think there are probably some other reasons for that. But I think that's also something that makes her feel countercultural, even by the standards of Black activism, certainly today.
That's a really important point, Jay. I think I've heard that argument. I read that argument. So there's some question about, well, again, I don't want to go too far off topic here, but even going so far back as, when Frederick Douglass was writing about, the influence of religion on the topic of slavery, he pointed out that there's the right kind of Christianity and there's the wrong kind, or misapplication or misuse of scripture. Anyway, I'm off on a tangent. I apologize.
It's a good one. When I think it's one to ask. I think it's good that we're bringing this question up, that y'all are highlighting this question in this way. James Weldon Johnson, who grows up in Florida and becomes a teacher and a lawyer and a poet and moves to New York, and in the midst of the lynchings of 1916 and 1917 is moved to respond. And he combines action and art. And one of the things that happens when he goes to, in the mid to late 20s, collect experiences of sermons, he goes and he's not a believer, and it's not intrinsically compelling to him, but he says, I was moved almost against my will. And one of the concerns that he brings as he's listening to these sermons is this a narcotic? Is religion the thing that is telling people to just care about the afterlife and not act? Or is it a source of sustenance? And Hamer lives intensely that choice between it's a narcotic, we just care about the afterlife, we take what we do here, versus like, no, God is involved and God cares what we do. And God cares about us in a way that affirms our humanity, even when nothing in the way Mississippi is built or in the way America is built around this set of questions is affirming our humanity. And it gives her, again, a place to stand. And I heard Jay mention joy, and there's a kind of humor, and I don't want to be cheesy, but I want to say it's a kind of holy humor. Like there is a humor that is sustaining her. She tells this story in one of the texts that we have up in the session that she tells often. It's at the top of 106 in America is a Sick Place and Man is on the Critical List. And she says, she talks about how she normally worked in the field and she would bring her own weight because the Marlowe's weight was fixed and it would give people less than what they had picked. And so she would bring her own weight. And she says, but sometimes it rained and I had to go into the house. Now, one thing that would really bug me was when they would tell me I couldn't eat at the table with them. I would have to wait for all them finish. So what I would do was eat first. I would just eat and have myself a time. And maybe some of the things I'd done wasn't right because I would eat out all the spoons and then watch them eat behind me. And then whenever they would leave home, I would get in the bathtub because I didn't have one. And I would get in that bathtub and I would take me a bubble bath. She puts it somewhere else where they say, you have to wait, you have to eat after us. She said, I don't tell them, but baby, I eat first.
That's great. That's great. It reminds me of Melanie made a comment about how she strove to, reading Melanie's comment, she strove to cultivate the genius, but she chose joy. Sort of intentionally chose or embraced this sense of joy. So that's really, really remarkable. I was just about to ask Sarah Beth, I'm glad you did this because I was about to just ask both of you. You recommended some great readings for today in the text, the documents that we've recommended. Can you point us to some passages, maybe your favorite passages, or some passages that you think really reveal some important things about who she was and why she was the way she was, or what she stood for and what she deeply believed in?
There's one later in that same document, America's a Sick Place, on 118, where she's pretty explicit, and this is a Northern audience, but she's still quoting scripture and being pretty straightforward. And she says, in the second full paragraph, says, "But the reason we are going to survive, if I told you that I hate you, I would be lying to you, because I see what hate has done to you. And I am going to do good. Where you have done evil about me, I'm going to do good. And I know it worked, because in Ruleville, Mississippi, it was a time that people wouldn't drive up to my house and they wouldn't stop. If they stopped for any length of time, they was arrested. And I remember a man, the mayor told me one time, said, 'Fannie Lou, if you're ever tired of what's going on in Mississippi, you've got to leave.' And I said, 'Well, I'll tell you what, Mayor, if you sick of looking at me in Ruleville, then you pack your ass up.'"
I love that.
So she's really, there's at every point. And again, I am so humbled in reading this stuff to even claim to have any kind of authority about the African American experience, or if her life is embarrassing to even contemplate. So it almost feels like a privilege occasionally just to kind of walk through her story and kind of see the world a little bit through her eyes. But no one would have blamed her if she had felt hate and if she'd felt anger. And that, again, I think that's one of the things that resonates about a Ta-Nehisi Coates, who has abandoned Christian faith and is among those who doesn't find that part of it at all. And his own writing is fairly bleak. And I think it's important to look at that and go, I understand why that was the conclusion you come to. Even more remarkable is her willingness to sort of root herself in love. And my wife asked me, and as we were talking about this, she said it's remarkable that she stayed a Christian through all of that. And my understanding of Fannie Lou Hamer, she would say, that's kind of the wrong way of looking at it. I think it's only because she's a Christian that she's able to have any sense of hope, or to maintain this resistance to the temptation to hate. So it's really, really astonishing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Really well put. Thank you, Jay.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah Beth, you wanted to jump in.
No, I share Jay's same sense. Sometimes I am teaching a class of African American political thought, and I walk in and the students kind of go, they lean back a little bit if I'm at a new school. And the first thing I can acknowledge is, yeah, I'm a white woman teaching this class, and I'm doing it because this tradition that Hamer is in is the richest American tradition for our human questions of suffering, of the meaning of suffering, of, as Baldwin says, ways to, or as he encourages us to find ways to make our suffering meaningful, but also of courage and of joy and of great sense of one's own action and one's own responsibility. And those are human questions. Henry Louis Gates says that a tradition is something that takes the very particular experiences and speaks to all of our experiences. And one of the ways in which people of all backgrounds, I think, can approach Hamer is with gratitude for her willingness to share the particulars of her human experience, which connect with our human experiences. We may not have suffering like hers, but we are not getting by without suffering. And we can learn something from her about suffering. We may not have challenges like hers, but we will have challenges. And if we want to learn something about courage and joy and a sense of humor, this woman has something to teach us. And so I often, I'm also like, how do I approach it? Where do I stand? What's my approach? And I think that she invites that. I also know from her own family, when I was editing an Ashbrook core documents collection recently. I was doing permissions. And so through a very circuitous route, I came to know one of the women who Hamer raised as one of her own daughters. She had several people that she loved into being. And when I talked to Mrs. Jacqueline Hamer Flakes, she reiterated to me how grateful she was that all of y'all and us, the panelists, but more importantly, high school teachers everywhere are caring. She was moved to tears to hear that y'all were out there because she didn't know you were out there. And she's really grateful that you're out there. And so I think she gives us some permission too to really dive into this story and to feel our own responsibility for how we tell these stories. So that's one thing about permission. There's a passage that I want to share, but we might have another question to take first, or we can go there. Either way is fine.
Yeah, go ahead, please. There are a number of questions left, but they're all, I think, sort of fitting together now into sort of three larger headings. So please point us to anything you
Sure.
want us to
Right.
note in the readings, and we'll come back to those.
That sounds good.
Those questions.
I love it. There's a paragraph that I think kind of captures, if you're looking for one paragraph that captures some of the themes we've been talking about related to the prophetic and related to her, well, it might help us to think about how she stands in relation to America. It's at 115, the first full paragraph of page 115 in America is a Sick Place and Man is on the Critical List. There's so much to choose from, but I'll focus on this. She says, I've seen what hate, and we all see what hate is doing to this whole sick country at this moment. So this is, again, part of the thing that her mom taught her when she was 6, that you can take on a moral, that you can avoid moral injury or you can injure yourself morally. And she's very sensitive to that. And she defends her own integrity through this active practice of forgiveness that Jay describes. But with what Hannah Arendt observes about forgiveness is it requires reckoning first. So it is far more honest than saying like, it's not a big deal. It takes stock of every piece of the injury and the pain. I've seen what hate, and we all see what hate is doing to this whole sick country at this moment. America is a sick place and man is on the critical list. She says that throughout her addresses. But we are determined to bring a change, not only for ourselves, but I believe that we are some of God's chosen people. You know, a lot of folks say, well, I don't believe in God. And a lot of young people say that I don't believe in God. But the reason they said they see so much hypocrisy in the churches. But I believe in God, and I believe in the beautiful passage in the 40th chapter of Isaiah and the 4th verse that says, the valleys will be exalted. And that's people. The mountains and the hills would be made level and the crooked roads would be made straight. We tried to go from the level of voter registration and getting people registered. And I want to tell you something about this county I'm from. It's what you call the ruralest of the ruralest, poorest of the poorest USA. This is the home of Senator James O. Eastland that in 1967 received $255,000 to let his land waste, while people on the plantation suffered from malnutrition. So this is a sickness that's not only occurring in Mississippi, because you have a hell of a lot of problems in Chicago. And the way that she weaves together this awareness that the tradition that sustains her is not everyone's tradition. And she has a diagnosis for it. People have seen a lot of hypocrisy. It's the same hypocrisy that turns James Baldwin off. Even though he is a theologian and a theologian of hope and action in so many ways. It's the same hypocrisy that people are constantly contending with in religion broadly. She has a diagnosis for why it's a problem, but she also has a diagnosis for the very concrete, practical injustices that are shaping her life. So that's, I think, one piece that kind of captures what she does. I'll observe to you that if you want to know more or hear her own telling of the story that we were mentioning about her daughter hemorrhaging, she tells that on the top of page 119. And there are other passages. Let's take a few more questions and see how we can weave these together.
Sure. Yeah, that's great. That was really beautiful, by the way. What a beautiful passage to point to. So there are a number of questions, sort of one group of questions having to do with her relationship with civil rights organizations. So Tom asked, what was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party? And there are a couple of questions on her involvement, to what extent she had an involvement with the NSCC. Some of the things you've both been saying and describing her philosophy, if you will, remind me very much of the nonviolence doctrines of King. So I guess from in terms of her relationship with organizations, can you talk something or say something about to what extent she was leading these things, involved with these things? And
the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was essentially, it was a little more than a protest movement, essentially, that was acknowledging that given the suppression of the Black vote in Mississippi, the all-white Democratic Party, and as by implication, the whole Mississippi congressional delegation was illegitimate. And her first real moment on the national stage came at the Democratic National Convention in, I think, Atlantic City in 1964, where she was given an opportunity to speak before the credentialing committee on behalf of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party to allow an alternate slate of delegates to be seated, given the injustices woven into Mississippi politics. So, and this is where she had the big confrontation with Johnson, where he was so fearful of an unsettling of this convention and losing the whole South, he preempted the national broadcast of her speech to give some sort of acknowledgement that it had been 9 months since the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Of course, this backfired because the speech probably got more attention than it would have. Johnson was still able to successfully keep the delegation from being seated, but they kind of lost the battle. But ultimately, by 1968, and this is really where you have the transformation of Southern politics, where it's really beginning to shift from Democrat to Dixiecrat, ultimately to Republican. And but by 1968, we really are seeing African Americans taking a greater degree of leadership within the Mississippi Democratic Party. And so that's the Mississippi Democratic Party. The only thing I'll say about SNCC is that it was their efforts to come down and try to register voters in 1962 where she first encountered, again, her knowledge that she had a constitutional right to vote. And they also both kind of gave her a framework to kind of and a strategy to help get herself registered and ultimately get others registered. And then she started to travel to national conferences to give her story. And it was Bob Moses, who was one of the main organizers of SNCC, had really kind of discovered her and really saw that not only does she have a powerful story, but she's also a doer. And so she did get a $10 a week stipend from SNCC. And after because she registered to vote, she and her husband they lost their jobs and they had to leave their home. And that was basically the only income she had for a long time. So I would say that SNCC was probably the most important, although she had connections with other organizations, SNCC was probably the most important.
Yeah, thank you, Jay. I'm glad you brought up the thing with LBJ as well, because I think that helped answer some questions that it sort of popped up earlier when sort of LBJ's I don't know, sort of dismissive, but what do you call that? That sort of quick hat tip to her or something like that had come up. But the question was, why was he why was this all taking place? I think you answered that. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. So sort of related questions. So I'll ask two together here. This is from Pete, which of the civil rights leaders did she align with? What type of support did she give to them? And then sort of related to that is, see if I can find it. Scrolling from Tanae, did Hamer have a connection with or opinion of the Black Power movement? So thoughts on?
From what I read, she's pretty open about her collaborations. She does speak alongside Malcolm X, and she is, there are a lot of fractures within the civil rights movement, but she's pretty open about her collaborations. She's very intent. Okay, I'll get you more. She's very intent on, Ms. Frizzle is not on the big screen. She's very intent on affirming Black power. And she gives this argument that Baldwin gives. She probably crossed paths and they could have developed it independently, but they also were working as a community of how do you create those arguments that whatever happens to Black people in America is morally tied to the choices of white people. And if white Americans contrive things, structure our common life in a way that violates or denies the humanity of attempts to deny the humanity of Black Americans, that moral fate is also going to be tied up in the life of white Americans. So she's aware of power like the later King, like James Baldwin, like Malcolm X, and sees that what we do with our power shapes our moral fate together.
Yeah, that's a helpful insight. She's by the time that she gives the again, this is the America's a Sick Place. By the time she gives that talk, and that talk is given in May of 1970. She also references Kent State in this and implicitly. She's getting a lot of comments and questions about things like the Black Panther movement and a kind of militancy that has emerged within the African-American movement. And I think she kind of turns it back on the questioner, because I think they want to sort of paint her with these terms. And she immediately asks the association of the questioner with the White Citizens Council, with Ku Klux Klan, with the Mafia, with the Minutemen. And I think just as Sarah has indicated, she's not condoning their violence, she's not advocating it, but I think she's acknowledging that there is a reason for their stridency, and this isn't coming out of nowhere. And I think that's an important insight that she brings. I hear a lot of the resonance with King in her thinking, and I think this is both, probably she's been a little influenced by King, but I also think they're coming out of that same tradition, and she does largely buy his arguments about the importance of keeping the movement both Black and white, keeping it integrated, but also her sense of nonviolence.
Yeah, thank you both. That's very helpful. So one more question, sort of along the similar vein here. Tabitha asks, was she known during her time as an activist, or was she sort of on the fringe of the civil rights movement during its height? And then sort of connected to that, Timothy asks, how well was she known by other civil rights female figures, such as Majeska Simpkins, Septima Clark, and Rosa Parks? These are pretty specific. We're getting to some specific questions here. So
I think that moment in 1964 at the Democratic Convention where she, that got a lot of attention. She became synonymous with the civil rights movement and synonymous with the question of voting, because the convention comes post Civil Rights Act, pre Voting Rights Act, pre Selma. So she, in the national convention, it's kind of hard to remember a time when you had gavel to gavel coverage, but this, every bit of it, even the credentialing committee hearings were broadcast on television, and So she did become, I mean, I don't know if I would say she became a household name. People talked about her speech because it was so personal. Let me just say this. I think we talk a lot rightly about the structural quality of racism. There's something about, though, hearing a personal narrative that, because structures are hard to see, right? They're nameless faces filled with a lot of data. This personal narrative, and this is the reason why Johnson was so fearful, because he knew that that story had power, and it did. So she was known. One of the things that occurred that illustrated how she had kind of risen to a status of civil rights, I don't want to say celebrity, but she was, soon after the Democratic Convention, Harry Belafonte foot the bill for a trip to Africa for a small group of some who were then prominent, some who would become prominent, like Julian Bond was on that trip, to West Africa, which was also, here's this woman who 2 years before didn't even know that she had the right to vote. Now she's traveling with Harry Belafonte and meeting the president of Guinea, a newly independent African country in West Africa, and seeing what's possible for African governing themselves. And that was so that gives some indication of her rising prominence in the civil rights movement.
Oh, that's really great. And then you said a few things about it, Jay. Could either of you say something about, Tine asks about how instrumental her speech was again in the passage of the Voting Rights Act? Her influence on that?
Yeah, I can. Sure. One of the things that she also did prior to her speech is she did a lot of organizing in the Freedom Summer, the efforts. So she not only trained students in the North for what they could expect, but she also played a role on the ground in this great organizing effort, which I think did shine a bright light on the tragedy of voting exclusion and the barriers that were put in place. And I also think kind of it also shined a light on how the Civil Rights Act was inadequate. It hadn't, and there were efforts to make make voting provisions added to the Civil Rights Act that didn't make it in. So I do think that she was a part of all of that, and I think again she becomes a kind of personal symbol, and her story as a reason why that it gained national prominence.
Yeah, I think that's all right. And I would want to draw out her question about democracy in America, right? Like beneath her organizing, beneath her attempt to move Black people to the polls, when like in her own part of Mississippi, in her own lifetime, as she's coming to this, a man is shot in broad daylight just for registering to vote, right? Like a Black man is shot by a white man in broad daylight. This is an incredibly risky thing, but her point is that she makes over and over. She makes this to a congressional subcommittee on elections at one point. 95% of the people in Mississippi who are Black can't vote. So is this really democracy, not only for us, not only for the Black community, but is this democracy for Mississippi when we don't have like the thing is not working like the theory says it's supposed to work? And so one of her constant reiterations, one of her constant goals is, how do you make democracy real? And that's why the speech that Jay has offered to us, that her DNC Credentials Committee testimony, when she concludes by saying, I question America. She's constantly questioning. And her questioning is constantly leading her to say, if this is who you want to be, then this is what it would take to make democracy real. And all of that practical organization, which brings not just the threat, but the experience of white terror on her. The man who killed Emmett Till, his brother comes into Hamer's house in the night with a gun. And we don't know her the way we know Emmett Till, but that connection and the fact that she makes that connection for us is extremely important for understanding what moves her to do that practical organizing and to want to make democracy real.
Oh, that's great. That's very helpful. So we're approaching the end of our time, and the last there are a number of questions all sort of connected here. So for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of condense them and paraphrase them a little bit. But there are a number of questions asking you to talk a little bit about the challenges that she faced as a woman in the civil rights movement. So Tom, for example, asked, why were many women of the civil rights movement treated, in a second-class way? So the fact that she was a woman obviously adds to her challenges. So we talk about the role of women and the challenges they especially faced, even as members of people pushing for civil rights reform.
Yeah, just to reiterate, the only real powerful independent institution that was controlled by African Americans was the Black church, as we've talked about, which was kind of a male-dominated institution. And I think that there was so much that was emasculating about the African American experience more broadly that it probably made some sense within the context of the time and the circumstances for men to assert a kind of traditional role in leadership within these with organizations and within the movement itself. However, if you've never been to an African American church, it's overwhelmingly populated by women, and there is also prominent roles played by women, not only in the pews, as it were, but even up front, both in terms of song and testimony. And so I think she's drawing pretty deeply from that tradition, even there, in asserting her leadership. And I think you see that elsewhere. Fannie Lou Hamer does speak a lot about women's issues, and she even plays a role. In 1971, she participated as a founding member of the National Women's Political Caucus in Washington, D.C., alongside some of the early advocates of the kind of the second wave, the group second wave feminism. And because she was so prominent in democratic politics, as both African Americans were rising to leadership and women were beginning to assert themselves kind of around the same time, by the early 70s, she's speaking on behalf of these issues as well. So I think she plays a pretty significant role in both cases.
Yeah, I'll drop a link to Henry Louis Gates has just, can y'all see that in the chat? There's a link. Has just produced a 4-part series on the Black church, and he gives a lot of story on these questions that we're talking about. What is it to be a patriarchal institution whose primary population is women, and how does that bigger dynamic work? This is a new piece on the Black church, which holds a lot of story that you might be interested in. She, as we've said, contends with those issues of care and of sustaining life. One of the pieces of her fitting in with larger women's movement is that she's opposed to abortion, she's opposed to the pill, she's opposed to IUDs, because she calls them genocide. And she's looking at the ways in which, I think this is part of her intimate experience of nurture and of life, and also her bigger sense of democracy, that part of the threat she perceives is literally being exterminated and having your numbers diminished as a people. And if power is supposed to come from being represented as human beings and having a voice, then I think she demands our attention when she describes that as genocide. It's one of the more uncomfortable parts of reading her, because it doesn't kind of fit with our contemporary political boxes. But I think it's important to listen to her tell her story and tell her whole story, because she promises to tell it like it is. So yeah, one more piece on her role and her involvement with women's issues and women's experiences. I'll also drop in here what I think is a really meaningful observation of one woman poet to all of us about Fannie Lou Hamer. And this is June Jordan's poem on Fannie Lou Hamer, and on her ways of caring, and on her strength, and on her courage, and on her humor. So I offer that to you as well.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Sarah Beth. And that's the last sort of set of questions. There's a whole bunch of them asking for things to read, suggestions. So there you go. Read that. This is your collection out yet, Sarah Beth?
Yeah, let me hang on, I'll show you this. So I would say read her address, Fannie Lou Hamer, or her collection of speeches, To Tell It Like It Is. This is a really amazing archival historiographic project. Collecting her speeches is not like collecting King's speeches. Collecting her speeches is like a lot of highways in Mississippi and a lot of attics and a lot of conversations, right? So this is an incredible work of history. Megan Parker Brooks and Davis Hook did an incredible job bringing this to us. So I commend this to you. There's another piece that I'll drop in here, which is just eminently readable and beautiful. Albert Rabbitoe has a chapter on Hamer in his 2016 Princeton book, which is entitled American Prophets, and his name is there. So that chapter, like if you want kind of a really beautiful, elegant summary, I offer you that. And then, oh yeah, I'm supposed to show you that. So let me pull this up for you. This is coming out. It'll be in print in just a few weeks here. Oh wait, you don't let me do screen share. It is a collected documents, The Prophetic Voice, Religion and History, Religion in American History and Politics. The volume is called The Prophetic Voice. It's about 32 documents from Roger Williams to Amanda Gorman, featuring people who all participate in the prophetic voice. From Sarah Grimke to Abraham Joshua Heschel to Fannie Lou Hamer, Thomas Merton, and more, Wendell Berry on the environment. And the goal is, how do we think for ourselves, and how do we share with our high school students exemplars of people who, whether they professed a faith or like James Baldwin, who's in the collection, did not personally profess a faith, take this confidence in justice and in some kind of divine care for justice and turn that into a way to speak to us about what it means to have our politics reoriented from a question that says, what is possible, to a question that says instead, what does my neighbor need? What does a human being deserve? And what kind of action do I take on in light, not of what's politically possible, but of the inviolability and the sacredness of the human person?
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah Beth.
Yeah, so that's out in 6 weeks in print, and it'll be online. We always do them for free online, and it has beautiful cover art by Kelly Lattimore, an iconographer, and he also has a great icon on Hamer, which I'll drop in the chat.
Great, thank you. Jay, before we ask Jay the same question about recommendations, Sarah Beth, you earlier in the webinar mentioned a movie. Can you repeat that? Catherine wants to know if you can repeat that.
I'll put it in the chat as well. This is Mississippi Public Broadcasting did a 30-minute documentary. It's incredible to use in a class because there's time to show it and time to talk about it, on Fannie Lou Hamer. It involves interviews with one of her daughters who died just a few months after it came out. And it's just a really incredible piece of history. So I'll drop a link to that in the chat.
Thank you very much. Sorry, Jay, didn't mean to.
No, and you should buy the collection that Sarah Beth has edited, and really check out all of the readers from Ashbrook, which are not only great, well edited, but also affordable. But I would recommend. I just have read this Charles Marsh's God's Long Summer, Stories of Faith and Civil Rights. It really highlights a number of really great figures and some really helpful stories. So I found his chapter here on Fannie Lou Hamer that really focuses pretty deeply on her faith and connecting it to broader issues of faith in the civil rights is really helpful. Another one, and I'd be curious to talk to Sarah Beth about this. This is David Chappelle's book on prophetic religion and the death of Jim Crow, A Stone of Hope. Really, it's a phenomenal, really powerful book, and it's a complex book in terms of it dealing with larger issues of religion and relationship between the Black church and the white church. And I would highly recommend this as a secondary source.
Heartily agree. It's a really great piece. Yeah, if anyone is interested in more on, I think that's the best piece on the prophetic tradition in the Black church in Hamer's moment. And there's an earlier piece, if you're just interested in tracing the tradition back further, for some of y'all who are into earlier work, Christopher Hobson has a book called Mount of Vision, which is another, I kind of like put those two pieces together. David Chappelle's book is the later piece, and then Mount of Vision traces the origins of the African-American prophetic tradition and is excellent in that kind of, I love to put those two pieces together for my own learning.
Well, great. Thank you so much. Those are great recommendations. I've just added a few things to my reading list as well. And really appreciate your thoughts and helping us think through this really important human being and her great accomplishments. So thank you so much. I've learned a great deal from our conversation, and I have a strong feeling that a lot of others did as well. So thank you both, and I wish you both the best, and look forward to hopefully seeing you together soon sometime in future Ashbrook projects. So have a great weekend. Thanks everybody else for joining us. Especially thanks for some great questions again. And just put another quick reminder about the email that you'll receive that will have your link for a certificate of participation. Again, if you enjoyed our conversation today, look into the other resources provided by TAH.org, including the collections of readers that Sarah Beth and Jay mentioned. There are many, many resources on that website, most of which are, of course, free of charge. So we want you to be able to take advantage of them and use them. Our final webinar in this series will be Saturday, May 1st, and we'll be discussing Sandra Day O'Connor with Josh Dunn of the University of Colorado at Colorado Springs and Eric Sands of Berry College. So hopefully you'll all be able to join us then again as well. And please spread the word to your friends and colleagues if you've enjoyed this webinar or others that you've seen, and post links on social media. Anything you can do to get the word out will be helpful. So thanks everybody, and I look forward to seeing you all in a few weeks.
Thanks so much. Thank y'all to all the teachers and the work you're doing.
Thank you
Yes,
very
absolutely.
much. Thanks for having us.
Thanks again for listening. You can learn more about our free programs, resources, and our documents collection for teachers, students, and citizens at Teaching American History or TAH.org.